Welcome to the Fire These Times. I'm your host Joey Ayoub. If you'd like to support this podcast as well as other projects, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check out the support page for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening and stay safe out there. So this is quite an odd conversation. My guests, Martin Parker and Thomas Swann, and I discussed a book that they co-edited and which was released recently, called Anarchism, Organization and Management. Now, I'm sure you must be thinking that there might be some mistake, that this is a confusing title, and indeed the title was crafted to attract your attention, and if you're listening to this, I'm hoping this means that this worked. But indeed, we often think of these two worlds, like the world of management and the world of anarchism, as being completely separate and indeed contradictory. After all, anarchism is largely anti-capitalistic, whereas management, especially the modern form that we find in business schools, tend to essentially produce capitalist thinking. Let's put it very simply. And this is where I think you might be wrong. This conversation will try and convince you there's actually more to it than that. My guests and I agree that we are facing a unique crisis in our world today, especially, of course, the climate crisis. But how are we going to deal with the climate crisis is something that is, of course, very difficult to think about. One, perhaps radical notion is to actually look at what management has to offer and look at what anarchism has to offer and try and find where they can work together. This is something that, again, I know is going to confuse a lot of people. But I hope that this conversation proves to be an interesting one for you to listen. And I hope that gives you some ideas, and I'll be very curious to hear if that's the case. Thank you for listening.
My name's Thomas Swann. I'm a lecturer in political theory at Loughborough University in the UK. My work is mainly focused on anarchist political theory and the connections between anarchist political theory and organisation theory. And so that's where the interest in sort of critical management studies and critical approaches to organisation comes from for me. In terms of work that I've sort of published, I've recently just published a book called Anarchist Cybernetics, which looks at the potential and practical relationships between anarchism and anarchist approaches to organisation and cybernetics, particularly the work of a cybernetician called Stafford Beer. And so that looks at different approaches to self-organisation, how that can be realised through things like consensus decision making and looking at problems of autonomy in organisations, and also links up with communication infrastructures and social media and how they can be part of a sort of approach to radical organisation.
My name is Martin Parker. I'm Professor of Organisation Studies at the Management School at the University of Bristol. And I've had a long interest in alternative organising, both in terms of thinking about different kinds of organisations like the circus or the zoo, whatever else, but also thinking about alternative economics. So being interested in co-ops and communes and local money and things like that. I'm currently the lead for the Inclusive Economy Initiative at the University of Bristol, which is linking academics with a whole bunch of activists across the city and city region in order to think about questions of low carbon economy, inclusion and workplace democracy. And I've had a pretty long interest in anarchism, which I see as being the kind of almost like the ultimate theory of organizing.
So one of the things I've read quite a bit of the book. I haven't finished through all of it, but one thing I quite enjoy, in addition to it being obviously well researched and well written, is how random it seems. And it's one of those things, and of course you do touch upon this in the introduction of like, why would you even talk about anarchism theory and management theory in the same sentence? So can we kind of get into this as a kind of a starter to this conversation, if that's okay?
Can I start off by saying something about the kind of the history of business schools in the UK?
Absolutely.
And to a certain extent in Northwest Europe more generally? Because remember that what we've got is a situation where even though some of the very first business schools were European ones, really the institution grows in North America with, places like Wharton and Harvard and so on from the 1870s onwards. So that's kind of established the conditions for business schools being quite distinctive places within universities. They don't grow in Northwest Europe very much until the 1980s, 1990s. And effectively that meant that a whole bunch of people who had prior training in disciplines like sociology and politics and other areas kind of drifted into parts of the business school because that's where the jobs were. And I'm an example of that. My PhD was in sociology with a bit of cultural studies and a bit of anthropology before that. And I worked in a sociology department, but eventually was hired by a management department to teach the kind of people and organizations aspects of management. And that's quite a common story in terms of the way that a bunch of social scientists from varied social science disciplines kind of brought a lot of intellectual currents into the Northwest European Business School, including, of course, various forms of Marxism, feminism, different kinds of environmental commitments, and sometimes a little bit of anarchism too. And though anarchism isn't a very big or certainly dominant current, it's been noticeable over the last couple of years that a number of people within Northwest European business schools have been kind of circling these sorts of ideas and using them in order to understand what they're doing and what a different kind of economy might do.
Yeah, I think I just add to what Martin said. I think, so for me coming into a business school, so my background was in political philosophy. And then when I was looking doing a PhD, I got in touch with people at the School of Management at the University of Leicester in the UK, which at that time, and I think still to a different extent, was one of the centres of the kind of critical approaches to management and organisation that Martin's touched on already. So it's quite a strange thing going from studying philosophy and political philosophy to being in a business school, which was something before that I'd never really imagined doing. I'd always had probably quite a low opinion of business schools and of people who taught in business schools and studied in business schools. So probably quite prejudiced in that sense, which was terrible. But the interesting thing about it was, I think, when I went there and started to meet people like Martin and a lot of other of the academics and fellow PhD students in that business school, and that was particular to Leicester. I think all business schools definitely didn't have that, was that there was a strong interest in, I think, what we could say sort of radical left and sort of libertarian left approaches to organisation. So there was people doing, touching on things to do with Marxism quite a lot, particularly sort of, more radical and libertarian approaches to Marxism. People drawing on things like queer theory. Now there's a lot of work in intersectionality theory and stuff like that. And so that was really interesting. And the one thing that I think, as Martin's kind of sort of hinted at, there was a sort of nod to anarchism in some of this literature, just sort of acknowledging that, well, there's these sort of different radical traditions we can draw on in critical management studies, such as, feminism, post-colonial studies, Marxism, and anarchism was sometimes mentioned, but there was never any kind of extensive or concerted effort to actually draw explicitly on anarchist literature or the anarchist political tradition or anarchist studies as an academic discipline, to bring that into critical management studies. So that was what myself and Konstantin Stoberod, who's one of the other editors of the volume, he was interested in it from a sort of political philosophy perspective, interested in people like Bakunin and Kropotkin, I think. And so that got us thinking about this, and we edited a special issue of the journal Ephemera, which was published in I think the end of 2014. And that was the first thing that I think that brought together a lot of people in critical management studies and some people working in anarchist studies and related disciplines, trying to sort of explicitly apply anarchist thinking and anarchist politics to a lot of the questions that people were discussing in the business school or discussing in the sort of critical management studies side of the business school, but we're bringing anarchism into that picture. So that was the first attempt to think of actually trying to bring anarchism more explicitly into discussions in critical management studies.
I think it's worth adding to that as well that, the kind of the Northwest European Business School has been particularly sort of omnivorous in terms of the way it's gobbled up lots of forms of intellectual projects from a whole variety of different areas across the social sciences and humanities. It's been a gigantic ravening mouth that has really tried to excavate things from lots of different places, sometimes just to sort of decorate academic arguments with, to drop a bit of Deleuze in here and there and that kind of stuff, but also in terms of thinking about different metaphors, different ideas from, say, popular culture and film and things like that in order to engage students or do research and so on. So it's been a real net importer of ideas, I think, something of a kind of a black hole. And I guess anarchism, and I'm doing this a bit glibly in a sense, is kind of one of those, isn't it? It's one of the things that the business school has been gobbling up. So I guess, I mean, there is something of a paradox here, isn't there, in the idea that management, which is very often imagined to be, one of the modern sciences of control, and business schools as being the place where control is taught, where the policemen are handed their truncheons, that's that kind of thing, for those on the left, then the idea that they should be interested in anarchism sounds like a very paradoxical one, since anarchists are committed to sort of freedom and the absence of rules and all this kind of stuff. I think that relies on two different sorts of parody. One is a parody of the business school as being a place that is only about certain kinds of very instrumental normative forms of control. Business schools are much more sophisticated than that and have been engaging with a wide variety of forms of organization theory for quite a long time in terms of thinking about the different ways in which organization structures and cultures and behavioral inducements and so on can produce particular kinds of employees or managers or whatever else. And it also, the other parody is the idea that anarchists aren't interested in management in the most general sense, because it seems to me that anarchism, in a sense, and I know that there'll be lots of anarchists who might listen to this who will disagree, is really an extended mediation on what it might mean to be organized. It's a long series of thoughts about what forms of organization are appropriate at what kind of levels, and what sort of theories of the human are required in order to understand the different forms of control, relation, association, and so on that exist. So for me, anarchism is actually a very pure organization theory. It's an organization theory without guarantees. And unlike lots of the organization theory that's taught within business schools, it doesn't make any necessary assumption about, the need for hierarchy or the need for particular kinds of expertise or about mandatory inducements or whatever it might be. It's a much purer organization theory because it assumes less, in a sense. And so that makes it of particular interest to me, in a sense. So why wouldn't somebody interested in organizing also be interested in anarchism? Of course they would.
I think there's also a question about why, when radical left approaches have been sort of brought into discussions around management and organisation, why anarchism wasn't there already, or it was there in part, but there wasn't a sort of cohesive school within those discussions. I think that's partly to do with the sort of opinion a lot of people have of anarchism. So even on the radical left, anarchism has a bit of a bad name. I think because people see it as quite a messy political tradition. There's not maybe the same sort of rigorous, coherent development of anarchist analysis that we see with things like Marxism and feminism and anti-racist politics. There is that in anarchism. If we look back at a lot of the classics, look at particularly work of people like Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, we do find that analysis there, but I think there is a sense to which it wasn't developed and worked out to the same extent as other approaches were, so it was maybe lacking. But I mean, perhaps this is just something that takes time. So if we think the resurgence in anarchism, both in terms of politics and in terms of academic study, only really happened from the sort of late 90s, early 2000s onwards. So with the ultra-globalization movement, that sort of put anarchism back to an extent centre stage in radical politics. Then you had sort of academic work, people obviously like David Graeber, sort of perhaps most prominently, Uri Gordon, Cindy Milstein, Mariana Mackelberg's work on ultra-globalization movement to an extent as well. Also, some of my colleagues in the anarchism research group at Loughborough University, Ruth Kinnett in particular, these kind of authors started making a mark and started publishing quite important works that developed anarchist thought from the early 2000s onwards. That was only really maybe the last sort of 10, 15 years that we really see those developments gathering speed. So perhaps it's just something that would always have taken until now, or until the last 5 years, to actually have a sort of strong impact in these discussions in critical management studies.
Oh, quite often the business school, though, I said that thing about, business schools being gaping mouths. Quite often they are late on the scene, so what you see is, that's questions that might be raised in arts, humanities, and some more radical elements of the social sciences around queer theory or post-colonialism or whatever. They kind of hit interesting bits of critical management studies and the business school and so on about 10 years after they've been fashionable elsewhere. We're usually playing catch up. So, maybe that's the case with anarchism too. It's sort of 10, 15 years after other people have been talking about it. Finally, people in business schools work out, there might be something here as well.
Coming from someone who is like outside the management world and the business world, and kind of like you, I think I've always had a very low opinion of it. And this goes back to my, undergrad years, that I did them at the American University of Beirut, and there was definitely the sense that more money was being put into the business schools than towards, I was in the health sciences, for example, and other schools as well. So that's definitely a theme. And their building is the fancier one with lounges and stuff like that. Whereas we had like one couch in the health sciences and stuff. It's true. We really had like a small, very tiny room for something as minor as epidemiology, which is quite ironic given the pandemic we're dealing with right now. Speaking of that, basically, what do you mentioned in the introduction that the 13,000 schools of business and the students that are targeted with this, like, what do you hope that they can get out of it, and why are you trying to target them directly? Let's put it this way.
Yeah, I mean, there's some very straightforward reasons for using the business school as a site for intervention, and that's partly to do with its scale, isn't it? I mean, that seems to be the case. There are at least 13,000 business schools across the planet. Something like 1 in 7 of the students in the UK are studying variants of business and management at the moment. So this is a big place for social reproduction. Every single university in the country has some kind of school of economics, management, finance, accounting, whatever it might be, and they're producing a particular kind of knowledge that reproduces global capitalism in its often most naked versions, particularly in the bits of kind of political economy and finance that they're teaching. So it's a really important site for those on the left to intervene in. Why you can't afford to ignore it. It's sculpting the understandings of a generation of students. That being said, it seems to me that it's far too easy to homogenize those students too. I've been teaching in schools of management and business probably for about 2 decades now, and I come across all sorts of different students with all sorts of different beliefs and motivations and ideas. And one of the things that I can safely say about most of those students is that they're pretty smart, and they understand that global capitalism doesn't work that well for everybody, and they understand that there's a climate crisis, and they understand the dangers of populism, etc., etc. What they don't understand is what kind of alternatives we might be putting forward. So it's that, my sense, and I don't know whether Thomas would echo this as well, is that very often when I'm talking to students, it's not like they're denying the world has plenty of problems. It's more that they don't understand what alternatives we've got. Yeah. That they are kind of, if you like, sort of overwhelmed by this massive and complex system, and don't understand how they might change it. So my sense is that what we really need to be supplying, and doing this in both sort of the writing, but also in the work I'm trying to do with a bunch of people, a bunch of activists in Bristol, is to kind of provide alternatives to ways of thinking about how the world might be constructed differently. And the organization, the structure of the organization, is one of the ways of thinking about that, right? So in terms of ideas about leadership and authority and responsibility and reward and all the rest of it, all this stuff can be rethought. And that's what the book tries to do.
Yeah, I think I'd just echo what Martin said. I mean, one of the really interesting things that I always found was when teaching seminars for first-year students in a business school, you always start with the kind of icebreaker sort of questions in the first seminar, like tell us who you are, where you're from, why have you decided to study business here? And you have this impression of people studying in a business school are these sort of ruthless capitalists out to make money at all costs. And the vast majority, I'd say, 95% of the students that I'd ask don't have that as part of their reasoning for being in a business school. For most of them, it's because it's considered a safe choice. They felt they had to go to university for something. Studying business seems like a safe choice. It seems like a sort of ticket to some kind of stable employment. There might be other expectations that pointed them in that direction, but they're definitely not firmly on the side of capitalism in a strongly ideological sense. So there definitely is, like Martin said, there is that receptiveness, there is that openness. It's just up to us to sort of put the resources in front of them and let them discover this and let them read through and experience these kind of alternatives. And hopefully they then take that on into the work that they do once they graduate. Hopefully, if they get a job in some kind of business type organization, they're trying to do good things in it. They're trying to change things, trying to run things in different ways. They might even, choose to work in the sort of cooperative movement or something like that is more directly trying to affect some kind of social change.
Just to give an example, which is one I often use in my teaching, and it's the same kind of icebreakery thing in a sense, is say reward, for example. So as soon as you start, talking in a business school context, you're usually talking about very asymmetric forms of reward, where people with MBAs and who are in charge of big organizations get paid many multiples more than somebody who cleans the floor. So I say something along the lines of, well, what if everybody in an organization was paid the same? And the students would respond by saying something like, well, that's just stupid. It's a disaster. What motivation would people have for working if that was the case? And then I tell them about SUMA, a worker co-op in the Yorkshire area of England, where everybody is paid the same and everybody is reasonably multi-skilled, and the organization's been going since 1976 and has been growing all through that time and is commercially successful and currently pays everybody about £10,000 more than the national average wage as a result. And that works. And then it becomes kind of impossible to deny that it works, right? It becomes impossible for them to say, but it can't work, because I've just said, well, it can. Here's an example of how it works. So presenting people with those kinds of ideas seems to me a way of then kind of breaking some of the often rather unreflective assumptions they might have about the way that the world must be, which might be based in human nature or economics or whatever it might be.
Yeah, there's always like you mentioned, the assumptions essentially within management theory, and the kind of excessive self-confidence that management schools usually have with these things is one of the things that put me off from management and business, from an early age. You mentioned how management theory tends to gobble up a number of schools, and this is like my impression of that is kind of like how the self-help industry sometimes, you would get a book on self-help, but management-oriented self-help. And, they would have random quotes by the Buddha and, Sun Tzu, and just random quotes that actually are not for that, but they kind of, it's like they have the answer and they're just looking for the thing to justify the answer, as you said, kind of like decorating the answer. You mentioned the example of that collective in Yorkshire. And when you mentioned that collective and then you show that, well, it's possible, what are the sort of conversations that can follow after that?
So what I think we've got is a kind of two-stage process here, really. One of the things that I'm doing in the classroom is undoing some of the assumptions that they have about what they think their common sense is. So, the idea that we have to be managed by managers, that we have to have hierarchies in organizations, that those hierarchies have to be reflected in status and reward, that organizations need to grow, et cetera, et cetera. It's all those, those, if you like, the kind of common sense of management theory. But that's only part of it, because of course, you doing that kind of work in the classroom doesn't necessarily then propel people into any particular form of action. So one of the things that we've been trying to do quite a lot at the University of Bristol now is to get students working with a whole variety of voluntary activist third sector kind of groups to see some of these problems in action, in a sense, and also to experience what it's like to do practical forms of organizing. Because it seems to me that's the necessary corollary of thinking about anarchism as a form of theory. And plenty of people who would argue, plenty of anarchists who would argue that anarchism isn't just a theory, it's a practice or a praxis, that involves engaging with the world and other people in particular kinds of ways. So it seems to me that we need, in order to do that second thing, in order to get students engaged in the world, that we need to rethink what the university is a bit and how it relates to the world that it's in, to get out of the seminar room and to think about ways in which we practically experience organizing.
So this kind of brings me to, we're dancing around and you did mention it quite a bit, but what are if someone's listening right now and they probably know some things about management theory without necessarily studying it just because it's so omnipresent, but they wouldn't know as much about anarchism, obviously. What would you say are some of the main differences between the two? And even if someone doesn't identify as an anarchist, let's say, what are some things that they may find useful?
My sense is that there's an awful lot in the business school that's kind of useful to anarchists, and an awful lot of anarchism that's useful in the business school, and for slightly different reasons in each direction. In terms of what anarchists can learn from the business school, there are lots of things about organizing that are about practical forms of skill and particular kinds of techniques. So, think about double entry bookkeeping, for example, the idea that you've got to be counting the cash that you get in and the cash that you get out. That's not the same as the kind of accounting that's taught within business schools, which very often rests on asymmetries of information between workers and managers, which assumes particular privilege for certain kinds of surplus value and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, any organization that's going to be remotely successful in a cash-based economy needs to make sure it's counting the cash, right? Otherwise, you're going to run out of money and you won't be able to pay your rent. So there are kind of techniques and tools within schools of management that I think are helpful for any ways of thinking about organizing. Where they differ from anarchist ideas is that usually they're then elaborated into a particular theory of human nature and markets that really assumes capitalist forms of exchange. One of the ways when I'm talking about this stuff sometimes that the easiest way to express what business schools do is to say that they teach capitalism. They teach us how to reproduce a particular form of political economy, of organization. And that means that very often the functional stuff about, how you count the money or how you let your customers know that you've got some nice pizzas for sale, whatever it might be, is kind of obscured by a whole range of assumptions about what organizations should be like, what people should be like, what employees should be like, and so on. And this is basically a kind of philosophical anthropology of human beings that says that they're basically competitive and selfish and motivated by money and all those kinds of things, and that the aims, and in terms of the kind of contemporary sort of version of neoliberal individualism, the idea that we should be motivated by getting ahead and advancement and particular sorts of status and consumption and all those kinds of things. So in a sense, it's what interests me most is kind of stripping away the ideological superstructure, if you want, from what the business school's doing and getting down to some of the very practical ways in which it is necessary to think about organizing. And anarchism can help us with that because, as I suggested previously, I think what we see in anarchism is 200 years of thought on what it means to organize.
Some of the main differences, so Martin's mentioned that often the way these different activities are inflected within the business school is due to the fact that they are built into a capitalist economy. And as he mentioned, that part of that is thinking about competition and how people relate to one another. I think it's interesting to look in the anarchist traditions, particularly if we look at the work of Peter Kropotkin. Part of what he did was try to challenge the sort of social Darwinist view of human nature, of saying that people are naturally competitive, that people will always sort of strive for mastery over one another. So a very sort of pessimistic corruption in a sense of Darwin's view of survival of the fittest, where fittest didn't mean best fit for a particular environment, but strongest. So Kropotkin was arguing against that. And one of the ways he did that was introduced or developed the idea of mutual aid. So he was saying that actually, if we look at not just human society, but a lot of animal species, how they develop, communities are at their most effective and strongest in terms of the survival of the community when people cooperate, and that there's actually a natural inclination towards cooperation in any kind of human or non-human animal society. And so I think part of the task is trying to link a lot of the activities that we can learn about through studying management and organisation and seeing how they can actually operate within a more sort of mutual aid focused account of political economy. That's just Kropotkin's view on mutual aid, but I think that in different ways does run through the anarchist tradition, the idea of cooperation rather than competition being at the heart of it. One interesting example of where we can see that worked out is in response to the coronavirus crisis. All over the world, we've seen mutual aid type organising take place, often explicitly called mutual aid, not always explicitly drawing on the anarchist tradition of mutual aid or Peter Kropotkin, but often still using a lot of the same sort of frameworks. So that was people in their communities cooperating to try and help each other survive the coronavirus epidemic, but also the sort of socioeconomic results of it. And at least from the work that I was involved in around that, because it was operating at a much larger scale than we're normally used to with anarchist organisation, and most anarchist organisations are a handful of people in a small collective doing very specific focused tasks. Suddenly it was working with huge groups of volunteers, wide range of skills, wide range of different kind of political and practical commitments. A lot of sort of very focused organisational thinking had to be done in those networks, and it worked best when it was done in non-hierarchical collaborative ways, but it did require quite serious thinking about, well, how do we organise? We're no longer trying to just promote anarchist book fair that's happening. We're suddenly trying to make sure that everyone in the community knows that they can contact this particular hub to get food to them. So it became much more serious and much more focused. I think it was really interesting to see how a lot of the activities there the organizational aspect had to be taken incredibly seriously. But it was happening in a more mutual aid collaborative framework, which is really interesting when we're thinking about how those activities can operate in relation to anarchism.
One of the most interesting things to me about mutual aid as a framework, as a philosophy, as everything, is how it's both so obvious to most people when you dress it down and you just mention what it is about. You don't even have to say the word anarchism. You don't even have to say any ism for that matter. You just say what it is about, and it just feels so obvious. It's how many people would treat their friends, would treat their family members, would treat their neighbors sometimes, that sort of thing. And yet at the same time, as soon as you expand that conversation to, well, if it's working so well for us, maybe it should work so well for society or for the world or for whatever. And that's immediately when we go directly to the superstructures, to the questions about, well, human nature. Well, this is not realistic. Well, this is not possible. And, there will always be evil people in the world. And any kind of, it's like the same instinct in some ways, like we find the answer to the questions that we don't want to ask in some ways in advance so that we don't have to ask them. So I'm very curious, like if we can transition, because one thing that COVID-19 has done, other than wreak havoc throughout the world, obviously, myself lost a few people I know in my community and so on. It's definitely something that is extremely, extremely difficult to think of. But one thing that it's also showed is that, well, for the most part, people feel that, well, in a time of crisis, we should come together. There should be some solidarity. Well, healthcare workers should be supported. Their salaries, there is obviously not. All of these things that, we might call like progressive politics at large become suddenly more obvious because it's no longer coated in anything else, the, sort of polarization that we see sometimes. So I'm very curious, like, how have your thought maybe changed or adapted, or what kind of additional thoughts you might have regarding the context of the COVID crisis? And I think it's inevitable to also mention the climate crisis as well.
That's superbly expressed, and I couldn't agree more, Joey, really. I mean, I think that just to pick up on both of those things, one, that sort of curious sense that I have that when people are talking about some of the things that they're most passionate about, that they care about, about their friends and their family and their kids and their communities and their ethnicity and their sexuality and all sorts of stuff like that, then they talk about it with almost a different sort of register than they do about economic life. And that's a really odd phenomenon, I think. The kind of various people have written about it, haven't they? The idea of the disembedding of economic life from everyday life, that sort of notion. For many years, I've been teaching courses in business ethics, and one of the places I start with that is to kind of talk about everyday ethics and the ways in which we might make judgments of other people in terms of the good things they do and the bad things they do and all that kind of thing. And then ask that question, so why do we have something called business ethics, which is some sort of different form of ethics than the ethics you might apply in your everyday life? Because that in itself is another example of that sort of sequestration, the separation of those logics, isn't it? Now, spinning that to the climate crisis, absolutely. I mean, I think both the COVID crisis and the climate crisis are extraordinary openings for those on the kind of the greenish left to think about ways of reiterating a message about various forms of collectivism against ideas of individualism. Now, this, does present some problems in terms of very libertarian forms of anarchism, which, obviously are committed to notions of individual freedom above all else. But for my sense, for the kind of the mainstream of anarchism, then ways of thinking about collective organization are absolutely central. There are all sorts of questions about what we might mean by that organization, what scale it might be, what kind of coercive effects we might accept on us, and so on. The kind of the balance between different conceptions of freedom from, freedom to, whatever, that kind of stuff. But the idea that we're a collective species that requires each other and the rest of the natural world in order to thrive is absolutely the case. Now, it's much easier to talk to students about that right now. Yeah, because as soon as you start talking about, what's happened as a result of COVID, and particularly how that might be a dress rehearsal for what we've got to do in terms of the climate crisis, then it's very clear, particularly in terms of the climate crisis, that of course we need to stop doing what we're doing right now. The forms of global pro-growth capitalism that we are currently experiencing are producing the problem. And to be brutal about it, this is about businesses. It's businesses that are emitting carbon. whether those are businesses that are building cars or flying aeroplanes or anything else. So business needs to change. Now, there can be, apart from the most ludicrous forms of Trumpian climate denialism, there can be nobody in my classroom who simply denies that's the case anymore. It's not possible for them to take that position. Now, there are a variety of other ways in which they might think that capitalism can reform itself and those those kinds of arguments, but they can't anymore argue that things don't need to change. And that in itself is a really important opening, I think, for people who are interested in anarchism and lots of other forms of radical theory and education to step into.
I think another side of this is thinking, so Martin's outlined the problem very well. If you think about what can the appropriate anarchist response be, and how can we ensure that runs through the sort of political activities we're trying to undertake. One of the big challenges we're facing, if we look back to the sort of ultra-globalization movement, there was still a sense of optimism there. So obviously they were dealing with, the way they framed the problem was this sort of global capitalist hegemonic reality that had to be resisted. But ultimately there was an optimism about, well, we can go local, we can go back to sort of small scale types of organization and types of economics. They can link together in different ways, but ultimately we can kind of go back to some sort of more immediate form of economic organization. I think we're kind of in a different situation now because the scale of the climate crisis is so vast that we know, if we believe the science, we know that there has to be an incredibly huge economic shift within a very, very short space of time to even mitigate the catastrophe. Not even, we're kind of beyond the point of thinking, can we actually avoid the catastrophe? How can we mitigate it and survive it? I mean, one of the sort of figures that was bandied around was like, we kind of need to do something like the fall of the Soviet Union in terms of the drop in economic production, something much, much more than that across the whole world within a very short space of time. I mean, we can talk about how realistic that is, but I think for anarchism, that poses the challenge of how do we achieve something at that scale? How do we, and the coronavirus epidemics kind of pointed towards similar things. The responses that are needed seem to be necessarily of a massive scale. So the question is, how do we do that? If we don't have an organisation like the state, if we don't have organisations like huge corporations, how do we make sure that the organisations we have, that we know we can be more democratic, can be more responsive to the needs of people? How can we ensure that they can link together, federate together to be able to tackle things on such a massive scale? And I think that's a big question for anarchist politics. How can we actually be relevant to the scale of the problems that we're facing? I think that's the big challenge now. Don't particularly have answers to that. I mean, I know there's a colleague of ours from the School of Management at the University of Leicester, Keir Milburn. I was writing a lot about trying to work in and against the state and trying to develop forms of sort of cooperative ownership and cooperative control of public resources that still operate within a function of like local or national governments, or maybe a bit more realistic in terms of achievability, but draw in a lot of the sort of ways of thinking about democratic control and popular control of industry that we need to be having. Perhaps these are some of the avenues open, but I think we need to be doing it now, and we need to be developing these things as fast as possible.
I'd also like to just say something about, and I have no idea whether Thomas would agree with me on this, that for me, the question is having forms of organisation that are adequate to the problems that face us. And that kind of means that in some senses, though I'm very interested in anarchism, I'm not an anarchist, in the sense that I do think there are large-scale organizational forms that might be necessary in order to deal with the scale of the problems that we're going to have to address. And that kind of means that I'm interested in any form of organizing at whatever scale that can achieve particular kinds of things. Now, anarchism is an incredibly rich resource for thinking about this kind of stuff, but so too is socialism, so too is feminism, so too is radical environmental thought, and so on. But the proper job of a business school right now, or what I'd rather call them the schools for organizing, should be thinking about what kind of intellectual resources we might need in order to understand how we organize differently for different sorts of problems. Because I think it is fair to say that anarchism has tended to focus on the proximate, on the close, on the small, and so on. That's been its kind of home turf. And even though you do have accounts of kind of large scale federalism and all the rest of it, it's kind of it's a proximate form of politics in many ways. Whilst I think there are other traditions that might also be pretty useful right now, and they tend to be traditions which are more invested in notions of large-scale organization, of say state ownership, state socialism, whatever, that kind of stuff. And I'm not hostile to those things. It's a question of, for me, using the right tool to address the problem. In the same way, I wouldn't say I'm a fan of hammers, or that I'm terribly keen on saws. Well, it depends what you want to do.
Yeah, I think this is why we saw so many anarchists, including myself and some others, not all anarchists, but quite a lot, in different ways get behind some of the sort of left-wing populist movements that we've seen recently, like Jeremy Corbyn's time as leader of the Labour Party, or Bernie Sanders in the US, because we kind of think, well, there has to be some kind of coalition that moves us forward. And we know it's not anarchist. We know these people aren't anarchists. The type of politics they're engaging in isn't going to result in a kind of anarchist utopia. But it seems to be moving in the right direction. It seems to be the point we're at in our sort of civilization, if you want to call it that there needs to be that progress in that direction. Even if it's not the exact thing we'd want, we probably need to contribute to it in some way if we're going to at all survive the next 50, 100 years.
For me, it's the climate crisis. I mentioned I have a background in the health sciences, and something that I like. Environmentalism in general is something that I focus on quite a lot, and it is the crisis that I would say has shifted my way of thinking the most in the shortest amount of time. In some ways, like really the past few years, if anything, I was always like on the green left, you might say, supporting, all the kinds of things that one would support, I guess. But the urgency of it is really something that has forced me to simply accept that we may have to think about things that we didn't want to think about before. And for someone, I mean, I don't know if I define myself as an anarchist either. It's something that I kind of like revolve around a lot more than anything, and always have for as long as I can remember. It kind of like, I don't care, essentially. Like, it doesn't matter to me if this particular solution would be called an anarchist solution, or it would be called a whatever else is solution, if that makes sense. Because the urgency, like the crisis, the urgency of it simply requires us to kind of get out of our comfort zone. And this also includes ideologically speaking, let's put it that way. And I was sort of like that as well. I have a lot of issues with Jeremy Corbyn, a lot of issues with Bernie Sanders, and they would still be there had they won. But at some point, this kind of like, I needed to adopt a lesser evilism kind of perspective, because, well, what we can't at the same time be fighting off the Tories and the Republicans and whatnot, and also at the same time be dealing with something so existential as to make any of these divides kind of like really meaningless at the end of it. And so, yeah, that was sort of my still is in many ways my sort of focus. I start with the climate crisis, and then I ask myself, well, what can we do to deal with that? And then what happens in the meantime, I try and get those ideas from as many places as I can, honestly. And anarchism is definitely a huge resource in that.
And if we think about that in terms of your original question about business schools, Joey, then that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So we can think about, okay, so how could business schools, however they might be repurposed, be useful in terms of thinking about low carbon, low growth alternative ways of earning money and doing stuff together? So rather than being on the problematic side of history, let's try and make them on the right side of history. And that kind of means that their power and reach and sheer number of students and so on could be an important political lever. It's not it's not an obvious place to begin the revolution, but from the atrium of a glassy business school, but nonetheless it might be a peculiarly important one.
If I can add to that as well. So the way I approach the US Democratic Party, for example, is I have a lot of issues with what you might call the mainstream Democrats, the Bidens and the Clintons and whatnot. And, I definitely agree with the vast majority of the criticism that is thrown towards them. But at the same time, I see the sort of stuff that happens around them. I kind of see the Sunrise Movement, Black Lives Matter sort of thing. These are not necessarily pro-DNC movements, obviously, but they have more room to breathe under a DNC, under a Democratic Party, than they would under Trump. Under Trump, I think we would right now be having quite a different conversation, to be honest, in terms of emergency measures and what to do, and people simply probably giving up within 4 years or something like that. And that for me is something that we really cannot afford with the climate crisis. It's not something that we can even entertain. And it's even with that in mind that I kind of approached your book, because almost most things I read these days, I mean, as long as they're nonfiction, but sometimes even fiction, I kind of try and think of like, how can this be useful? How can I show someone who I may meet who is in, a business school and is having these doubts and having these questions in the back of their mind and is not finding them in those usual textbooks, what can I show them? And it's kind of that extremely hyper pragmatic approach to things that I've started to take. And your book does that quite a lot for me personally. And I do think, I would sort of conclude, if you want, on my side, and then I'll leave the floor to you. I do think this is something that listeners, whether they are in management schools or not, to be honest, can quite get out of. And so I was wondering if I can get your kind of final thoughts, in some ways, reflections, and what do you think people can do with your book as well? I know we've already spoken about that a lot, but kind of like as a closing note.
It's interesting in a way, in that I think that one of the things we need to understand first is just how paralyzed a lot of people in universities are right now. So, universities across the global north, particularly those that exist in highly marketized systems like North America and the UK, are now engaged in a strange kind of competition for status and resource, in which academics are increasingly kind of commodities who are traded, who are publishing particular articles in particular journals, the journals themselves owned by large multinational knowledge corporations and all the rest of it. So in a sense, all the dice are stacked against the idea of universities being kind of places that we might have imagined them to be for a bit in the 1960s, 1970s, sort of lighthouses of radicalism and enlightenment and all this kind of stuff. But nonetheless, those are the institutions that we have right now. So it seems to me that it's incumbent on anybody who has kind of green left beliefs that they should try and use these institutions in as productive a way as possible in order to push towards the kind of goals, climate goals, social goals, whatever they might be, that the three of us would probably believe to be desirable. And that does require a kind of entry as politics, doesn't it? It means, understanding where you sit and what you can do with it. One of the things I keep coming back to, an ex-colleague of mine, Stefano Hani, together with Fred Moten, wrote a book on the undercommons, and this idea of kind of the university as being a place that you can kind of burrow around the basement in, stealing stuff for other people. Yeah, I kind of like that sort of idea of, let's use this place with its resources and its sandwiches and its rooms and all the rest of it, and try and turn it towards holding hands with our allies, to trying to make it useful for them, rather than just being a kind of a status machine which teaches people how to be capitalists.
Definitely agree with that. We need to try and, as much as possible, channel what resources we've got access to in universities, and not just in business schools or schools of management, but across universities, towards things that we think are going to have some sort of positive change in the world. And I think a lot of academics are trying to do that. Universities make it incredibly difficult for us to do that, but it is something a lot of people have that as an aspiration. So we just need to work out how can we do that. I mean, in terms of what people could do with the book itself, I think there's the thing that we've talked a lot about is what impact we think it could have for students of business and management, and the kind of thinking that it could hopefully maybe kickstart in them, or if they're already thinking along those lines, just give them some sort of resources and some sort of support for that. But also, which I think that the book doesn't necessarily do, but I think we'd quite be interested in sort of following up with this, is how can we sort of turn the book around in a sense and think, okay, so this is a book introducing anarchism to business students. What kind of resources do we need to have in place so that anarchists and other radicals can learn from what's happening in the business schools? How do we channel knowledge that way as well? Because that's, as we've discussed already, there's a lot to be learned from there. So we have to think, what's the most effective way of having that sort of direction of traffic for that knowledge? It's probably not in the form of a book like this, because this book is, particularly designed for something that could be bought by university libraries and then provided as secondary reading on certain modules in the business school. A book like that's not going to work thoroughly. So what kind of format, what kind of resources could provide the support for not just anarchists, but other forms of radical organisation that there might be the seeds for in what's happening in business schools?
Martin and Thomas, thanks a lot for your time. This has honestly really been very, very fun and very interesting to me.
That was
Thank
great.
you very much.
Thanks for asking, Joey.